In 1939 to 1941, the supply problem that later defined Lend-Lease to the USSR was shaped by decisions taken before the first convoy steamed north. Britain, already on a convoy footing after September 1939, needed industrial inputs and weapons to sustain its own war while also tying Germany down at sea. The United States, constrained by domestic neutrality sentiment and the Neutrality Acts, moved stepwise from cash and carry in late 1939 to the Destroyers for Bases deal in September 1940, and finally, the Lend-Lease Act of 11th March 1941. Washington's stated goal was to act as the arsenal for those fighting the Axis, while remaining outside direct combat until national security required otherwise. The Soviet Union, bound to Germany by the August 1939 Non-Aggression Pact, shifted abruptly after 22 June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa opened an eastern front measured in the thousands of kilometers and immediate losses in personnel, rolling stock, trucks, and aircraft. Within weeks, British and American planners judged that sustaining Soviet resistance required large, steady flows of materiel, not episodic gifts. The geography of delivery routes, Arctic, Persian, and Far Eastern, imposed different constraints before a single crate crossed the quay. The northern route hinged on Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Murmansk, linked to the interior by the Kirov Railway, was ice-free but exposed to bases in occupied Norway. Arkhangelsk offered sheltered approaches through the White Sea, but iced over for months. The seasonal polar night, from roughly November to January, reduced Luftwaffe reconnaissance and attack windows, while summer's continuous daylight increased detection risk. The Persian Corridor required political control of Iran's ports and railways. The Anglo-Soviet intervention of August 25, 1941, secured Basra, Khorramshahr, and Bandar Shahpur, and connected them by the Trans-Iranian Railway to the Caspian. That route avoided German naval and air interdiction, but demanded rapid expansion of berths, locomotives, repair shops, and road haulage across mountain passes exceeding 2,000 meters. The Far Eastern route depended on the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of April 13, 1941. Cargoes shipped across the Pacific to Vladivostok could proceed under Soviet flag through waters patrolled by the Imperial Japanese Navy, which generally refrained from interference while the Neutrality Pact held. This path minimized combat losses at sea, but was bounded by the USSR's own merchant fleet capacity, Pacific port throughput, and the long Trans-Siberian rail haul. All sides weighed risks and payoffs. London's Admiralty assessed convoy cycles to the Barents and White Seas against escort availability, U-boat concentrations, and the range of torpedo bombers operating from northern Norway. The Royal Navy could generate close escort groups of destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers, but heavy cover capital ships were finite and also tasked with Atlantic and Mediterranean commitments. The United States Navy, prior to December 1941, provided limited support short of combat. After entry into the war, it increasingly shared Arctic escort and logistics burdens. In Moscow, the State Defense Committee measured port and rail capacities in wagon days, prioritized scarce cranes and winterized rolling stock, and directed labor to clear Arctic quays under air attack. Soviet planners judged that even modest monthly tonnages of trucks, rails, aviation fuel, and explosives could restore unit mobility and keep rail hubs operating through winter. Berlin, for its part, viewed the northern convoys as an opportunity to inflict measurable economic damage. Kriegsmarine Command sought to combine U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft to raise loss rates above politically tolerable thresholds in London and Washington. Tokyo balanced its continental war in China and plans in the Pacific with a desire to avoid reopening hostilities with the USSR. For most of 1941 to 1944, it tolerated Soviet flag sailings to Vladivostok while monitoring cargoes. Industrial readiness determined what could move once policy allowed it. U.S. shipyards began mass production of Liberty ships in 1941, with standard cargo deadweight around 10,000 tons and a build time that fell from months to weeks. British yards produced escorts and merchantmen, while also repairing battle damage. On land, U.S. factories scaled output of 2.5-ton trucks, locomotives, rails, and signal equipment. British industry furnished torpedo nets, degaussing gear, and Arctic clothing. Soviet requests emphasized transport and raw materials as much as finished weapons, rails to replace destroyed lines, prime movers for depots, aluminum and copper for aviation and electrical applications, and high-octane fuel to raise engine performance. The composition of cargoes would later determine which route made sense in which season. Bulk rails and vehicles through Persia, where discharge and storage were expansive. Time-sensitive munitions and aircraft components via the Arctic, when escort strength and darkness favored passage. Durable goods and machine tools through Vladivostok to avoid combat exposure. Intelligence estimates framed expectations of loss and throughput. British naval intelligence drew on aerial reconnaissance of Norwegian fjords, radio traffic analysis, and meteorological reports to identify windows when storms degraded German air operations, but remained navigable for convoys. Soviet services reported on rail choke points and the vulnerability of Murmansk's marshalling yards to attack. German estimates highlighted the difficulty of sustained interdiction during the polar night and prioritized mass strike opportunities when convoys were detected early in summer light. American planners in the Persian Gulf calculated port discharge rates in tons per ship hour and modeled the number of trucks and drivers needed to move cargoes from Basra to railheads without creating yard congestion. Public sentiment and political signaling affected tempo. In the United States, opinion polls through 1940 showed majorities favoring aid to Britain short of war. By mid-1941, after the passage of Lend-Lease, debates shifted from whether to how fast, with scrutiny on accountability and delivery schedules. British statements stressed common interest in keeping the Eastern Front active, presenting convoy losses and arrivals in amends debates to justify resource allocation. Soviet media emphasized self-reliance while acknowledging foreign deliveries as part of Allied cooperation. German propaganda publicized convoy sinkings to signal the vulnerability of maritime supply. Japanese outlets downplayed Vladivostok traffic to avoid highlighting tolerance of Soviet shipments amid a Pacific war. By late 1941, planners in all three Allied capitals accepted that no single route could carry the entire burden. Rough comparative targets took shape. The Arctic route would move high-value materiel quickly, but with exposure peaking in summer. The Persian Corridor would ramp from small beginnings towards sustained monthly tonnage as ports, rails, and depots expanded. The Far Eastern route would provide steady flow, constrained by Soviet shipping and rail, with low sea loss risk so long as neutrality with Japan held. Early estimates envisioned the Arctic carrying roughly a quarter of total tonnage, Persia another quarter to a third once fully developed, and the Pacific the balance, ratios that would be refined by experience. The preconditions were therefore not merely diplomatic acts or industrial promises. They were calculations about distance, season, escort density, crane lift, axle load, and the probability that a ship, a locomotive, or a crate of bearings would still be moving a month after departure. War could not wait for infrastructure to mature. After 22 June 1941, the first operational decisions were designed to push supplies toward the USSR before winter stopped northern ports and before German pressure severed fragile links. On July 12th, London and Moscow signed a mutual assistance agreement. On July 31st, the British War Cabinet authorized immediate sailings to northern Russia under Royal Navy cover. The Admiralty assigned the home fleet to protect the northern leg, with convoy commodores drawn from experienced merchant captains and close escorts provided by destroyers and corvettes of the western approaches and home fleet commands. The Ministry of War Transport coordinated hull allocation, while the Air Ministry detached RAF elements to Iceland and northern Scotland to extend reconnaissance range into the Norwegian Sea. Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters at Polyarny prepared anchorage control and mine countermeasures for Kola Inlet, and Arkhangelsk authorities mobilized labor brigades to clear quays and lay temporary track straight onto the piers to shorten unloading cycles. The first test case, later designated Operation Dervish, sailed from Hvalfjord in Iceland on 12 August 1941 with a small group of merchantmen, arriving at Arkhangelsk on 31 August. The consignment included aircraft in crates, aviation fuel, and general stores sized for quick handling by limited cranes. A Royal Navy covering force positioned cruisers and a carrier between Bear Island and the Norwegian coast to complicate Luftwaffe attack patterns. On arrival, Soviet port services used barges to move lighter cargo upriver, while trains loaded at temporary sidings that fed directly into the Arkhangelsk-Vologda line. No ships were lost on this initial run, and the exercise validated a northern cycle. Assemble in Iceland, sprint through the most exposed arc under heavy cover, and disperse into Soviet ports according to seasonal ice conditions. Formal Lend-Lease schedules followed policy. On October 1, 1941, London, Washington, and Moscow agreed a first protocol period ending June 30, 1942, that specified monthly targets of aircraft, tanks, and trucks, alongside minimums for raw materials and explosives. Within this framework, the Admiralty initiated a naming sequence for regular convoys. PQ-1 left 28 September with 11 merchant ships and arrived 11 October without loss. QP-1, the reciprocal westbound, sailed 28 September with empty hulls and returned safely, proving that the route could handle both directions if escorts were available. PQ-2 departed 13th October and reached its destination by the end of the month. The pattern emphasized autumn and early winter sailings to exploit decreasing daylight and rough weather that complicated German air operations, accepting the cost of ice accretion and the need for de-icing drills on escorts. In parallel, Anglo-Soviet operations in Iran on the 25th of August 1941 secured the ports and rail trunk that would become the Persian Corridor. British and Indian Army formations entered from the south and west. Soviet units crossed from the north toward Tabriz and Tehran. A joint military control commission stabilized internal security and protected the Trans-Iranian Railway. The government of India's port directorate at Basra and Abadan began surveying berths, dredging channels, and requisitioning lighters. The war transport hierarchy allocated coastal craft and river steamers to move cargo from deep draft anchorages to piers sized for shallow water. Early discharge rates in the autumn remained low by design, with priority given to rails, locomotives, trucks, and workshop equipment that would raise capacity. British engineers laid out depot grids near Khorramshahr and Andimeshk, and organized road convoys across the Zagros, using 3-ton and 5-ton lorries with enforced rest and maintenance intervals to reduce breakdowns on mountain grades exceeding 2%. Across the Pacific, the Far Eastern route was activated under the constraints of neutrality. The Soviet-Japanese Pact of April 1941 permitted Soviet flag ships to call at American and Canadian ports. To avoid incidents, cargoes booked to Vladivostok were consigned to Soviet lines and documented accordingly. U.S. authorities applied customs and security inspections, while the Soviet consulate and trade representatives arranged charters and crews. The War Department and the U.S. Maritime Commission coordinated with West Coast terminals to segregate Soviet-bound cargoes from those destined for the Southwest Pacific. Imperial Japanese Navy patrols observed sailings, but did not interfere while neutrality held. On arrival in Vladivostok, the People's Commissariat of Railways directed transshipment onto the Trans-Siberian main line, assigning wagon priorities by commodity group. Fuels and explosives under guarded schedules, vehicles on flat cars with lashings standardized to reduce load times, and machine tools moved in sealed cars. Command structures evolved to manage the complexity. In Britain, the Admiralty's Trade Division synchronized convoy timing with escort readiness and intelligence on U-boat dispositions in the Norwegian and Barents sectors. The Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet apportioned capital ship cover when risk from German heavy units was assessed as high. Naval intelligence drew on radio interception and photographic reconnaissance to adjust routes north or south of Bear Island by a few degrees of latitude to avoid known strike corridors. In the USSR, The State Defense Committee set delivery priorities and assigned the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade to match cargo manifests to factory and front demands. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk port committees included representatives from the railways, the Northern Fleet, and local civil authorities to balance unloading, storage, and onward shipment. In Iran, British Pay Force headquarters in Baghdad and later in Tehran managed southern lines of communication, while a trilateral supply board handled berth assignment, rolling stock distribution, and customs clearance. Initial loss rates reflected the cautious scale and timing of early operations. The Dervish movement and the first numbered convoys arrived without losses. Luftwaffe units based at Banak and Bardufos probed with reconnaissance and occasional attacks, but escort alertness and the weather-limited effects in autumn 1941. U-boat patrol lines had not yet concentrated in the Barents Sea, and German surface forces were still integrating into a coherent northern strike plan. Conversely, the northern ports showed their limits immediately. Quays lacked heated storage, cargo handlers worked in shifts around air raid alerts, and rail marshalling yards clogged when trains were not released quickly to the interior. The Persian Corridor, while secure from German interdiction at sea, displayed a different set of constraints: a single-track mountain railway with steep gradients, limited tunnel clearances that affected locomotive classes, and a shortage of heavy cranes to lift rails and vehicles quickly. The Pacific route, although free from combat losses at sea in this phase, depended on the finite capacity of the Soviet merchant marine and the throughput of Vladivostok's cranes and siding lengths, which imposed absolute daily ceilings. Reactions to these first moves were measured against expectations. British staff considered the initial safe arrivals necessary proof that the Arctic cycle could function through the winter. Soviet authorities pressed for higher rates, emphasizing trucks, rails, and alloy metals to restore mobility and production. American planners observed the early months to calibrate where to invest in capacity increases, escorts and weather routing for the Arctic, rolling stock and maintenance shops for Persia, and chartered tonnage for the Pacific. German command recognized that the absence of losses in the first convoys would harden Allied political will. Subsequent directives prioritized reconnaissance coverage during spring and summer, when daylight would extend attack windows. Japanese authorities maintained neutrality while monitoring West Coast loadouts and Soviet port calls, balancing their own conflict with the United States after December 1941, with the desire to avoid a new front against the USSR. By the end of 1941, the opening phase had established three functioning, though uneven arteries. The Arctic convoys could move compact, high-priority cargoes on a roughly monthly rhythm under growing escort experience. The Persian Corridor had political control and a staged plan to convert ports, rails, and roads from minimal to serviceable throughput. The Far Eastern route provided a comparatively safe but capacity-limited channel tied to Soviet shipping and a long rail haul. Each decision, when to sail in the north, what to push through Iran first, how many hulls to reserve for Vladivostok, reflected a common calculation: tonnage delivered per day against risk per mile, measured route by route and season by season. Planning began with arithmetic that tied strategic aims to feasible movement. London, Washington, and Moscow sought to keep Soviet field armies mobile and Soviet factories operating at rates sufficient to absorb frontline losses. That translated into monthly targets measured not only in tanks and aircraft, but also in trucks per rifle division, rails per kilometer restored, and fuel per regiment day. Planners built route-specific tables, a northern cycle for compact, high-value cargoes that had to arrive in weeks, a Gulf-Caspian cycle for bulk items that could tolerate longer lead times, and a Pacific cycle for steady shipments constrained by Soviet hulls and Trans-Siberian rail capacity. German and Japanese staffs constructed opposing tables. Berlin aimed to raise the probability that a ship would be sunk or turn back to levels that would force a diversion of Allied resources away from northern waters. Tokyo intended to maintain watch over Vladivostok traffic, while avoiding incidents that could void neutrality. Objectives were set in parallel with convoy rhythms. In the Arctic, British naval staff proposed a sequence of eastbound convoys at roughly 3 to 4 week intervals in autumn and winter, when short daylight complicated German reconnaissance and torpedo bomber attacks. Westbound returns would be offset to avoid overlapping coverage windows near Bear Island. Escort compositions were standardized: close escort screens of destroyers and corvettes, an anti-aircraft cruiser when available, auxiliary trawlers for rescue duty, and distant cover of heavy units and, if assigned, a carrier group to extend fighter and search range. Cargo planning prioritized aircraft in crates, radar sets, vehicle spares, and explosives packed for rapid discharge by limited Arctic cranes. Ice accretion and icing on superstructures were treated as predictable loads. Ships received de-icing gear, and escorts trained to rotate stations to clear topsides. On the Soviet side, port and rail committees scheduled wagon blocks to match expected convoy parcels, reserving through paths on the Arkhangelsk-Vologda and Kirov lines, and staging fuel and labor to work continuous shifts under air raid protocols. The Persian Corridor plan accepted low initial throughput in exchange for growth. British and Indian engineers mapped dredging priorities at Basra and Khorram Shah, laid hard-stand yards for vehicles and rails, and calculated discharge goals in tons per ship hour. The Trans-Siberian Railway, a single-track mountain line with steep gradients and tunnel limits, required additional locomotives, spare parts, and maintenance shops before targets could climb. Road haulage tables specified numbers of 3-ton and 5-ton trucks, driver rotations, and maintenance intervals to clear mountain passes without breakdown cascades. American participation would expand in phases: ship locomotives and rolling stock, establish repair depots, train local crews, and then push monthly totals upward toward planned 5-figure tonnages. Cargo composition was tailored to the corridor's strengths: vehicles, rails, bridging equipment, lubricants, and machine tools that benefited from ample yard space and could be marshaled in inland depots before transfer to the Caspian. Pacific planning depended on legal status and Soviet shipping. Because neutrality with Japan permitted Soviet flag sailings but restricted Allied flags, manifests were written to Soviet consignees and loaded at segregated West Coast berths. U.S. port authorities scheduled inspections to minimize delays and avoid conspicuous concentrations that might provoke protest. Vladivostok's plan emphasized quick turnarounds, standardized lashings for vehicles on flat cars, pre-built blocking for crated machine tools, and guarded schedules for explosives and fuels. The Trans-Siberian mainline's axle load limits, siding lengths, and winter operating rules imposed predictable ceilings. Monthly targets therefore aimed for steady, low-loss delivery rather than surge capacity. Soviet rail authorities synchronized eastbound empties and westbound loads to reduce idle wagon days and allocated locomotive cycles by commodity priority. German interdiction planning integrated air, surface, and submarine assets in seasonal layers. U-boat patrol lines were placed along likely convoy arcs north and south of Bear Island, with refueling and rest points in Norwegian fjords. Luftflotte, 5 prepared torpedo bomber groups to exploit summer light, coordinating with reconnaissance flights to mass attacks when convoys were detected early. Surface units, battle cruisers, and heavy cruisers based in northern fjords were reserved for rare strike opportunities when cover forces appeared weak or dispersed. The desired effect was not continuous attrition, but episodic spikes in losses that would influence Allied political decisions about risk. German staff acknowledged that polar night reduced detection and attack probability. Summer plans therefore carried the burden of raising loss ratios above thresholds that would cancel or defer sailings. Seasonality was built into every timetable. Arctic schedules shifted toward heavier cycles from late autumn to early spring, accepting weather and icing in return for reduced exposure to air attack. Persian plans weighted growth through springs and summer as dredging, shop construction, and crew training matured. Pacific plans assumed year-round movement, with winter allowances for ice management in the Sea of Japan and snow operations on the Trans-Siberian. Tonnage curves reflected these choices: northern throughput peaking in winter, Persian totals climbing with infrastructure, and Pacific lines holding steady within port and rail constraints. To compare routes, Allied staffs used a common metric, tons delivered per calendar day per route, adjusted by expected loss rates. In planning tables, the Arctic promised short transit times with a higher variance tied to summer risk. Persia offered rising low-variance throughput contingent on engineering milestones. The Pacific offered low-variance, medium-volume flow bounded by Soviet hulls and rail. Preparations included measures to reduce known bottlenecks. In the north, cargoes were pre-sorted for immediate rail loading, with labels and manifests harmonized in English and Russian to limit quayside delays. Additional portable cranes, sledges, and heated sheds were requisitioned to keep wharf operations moving during freezes. Escort commanders received meteorological routing support to thread storms that could conceal movements without exceeding ship endurance. In Persia, modular depots and repair shops were prefabricated, shipped, and assembled near railheads, and locomotive classes were matched to gradients and tunnel clearances. Driver schools set standardized maintenance intervals to guard against attrition on mountain roads. At Vladivostok, marshalling yards were reorganized to feed long through trains, rather than a series of short, mixed consists that would clog sidings across Siberia. Miscalculations appeared in the margins. Early Arctic plans underestimated the effect of concentrated torpedo bomber attacks during continuous daylight, and assumed that distant cover could deter surface sorties more often than weather allowed. Persian tables undervalued crane lift and workshop depth, creating periods when rails and vehicles arrived faster than they could be processed inland. Pacific schedules overestimated the availability of Soviet merchant hulls during simultaneous demands elsewhere, and found that fuel and hazardous cargo handling required more guarded storage than docks initially provided. Each error fed revisions, added anti-aircraft ships to some northern convoys, accelerated shipments of cranes and shop equipment to the Gulf, and adjustments in West Coast berth allocation and documentation for Vladivostok consignments. Propaganda and public accounting served operational ends. Allied statements emphasized delivery targets met within protocol periods while avoiding details that would expose schedules. German communiques highlighted sinkings and reconnaissance successes to influence Allied debates about risk and to reassure domestic audiences of control in northern waters. Soviet releases framed incoming cargoes as industrial cooperation and reported factory outputs rather than shipment specifics. These narratives did not decide routes, but they affected the tolerance for losses and the political room to adjust convoy tempos, escort allocations, and investment in port and rail expansion. By early 1942, the planning framework was a living instrument. Each route had a defined role, a monthly target shaped by season, and a correction mechanism triggered by loss reports and port statistics. The strategic goal remained unchanged across capitals: convert industrial promise into usable combat power by moving precise cargoes along paths where time, weather, and probability favored arrival. The first sustained confrontations came when numbered Arctic convoys began to meet organized German opposition along the Bear Island North Cape, ARC, in early 1942. After the loss-free pilot movements of August-October 1941, Dervish and PQ 1-2, established procedures, eastbound sailings increased under polar night cover. As daylight lengthened from February, reconnaissance from northern Norway located convoys more reliably, and attacks combined U-boats, torpedo bombers, and, on opportunity, destroyer groups. British staffs held to the winter rhythm, but hardened screens and routing, while Soviet port commands tightened rail release from Murmansk and Arkhangelsk to prevent key congestion under air alerts. The change from validation to combat contact marked the transition to a campaign where tonnage delivered would be measured against loss probabilities that rose with each additional hour of daylight. Convoy PQ-13, which sailed in late March 1942 with 19 merchantmen, offered a clear early case. Located and attacked in a sequence of actions on March 28th to March 29th, the convoy lost 5 ships, 2 to aircraft, 2 to submarines, and 1 to German destroyers, while 15 merchantmen reached northern Soviet ports. A Royal Navy cruiser was damaged during the fighting, and 1 escort was lost. These figures signaled that, as spring advanced. Even heavily escorted convoys face loss rates that could approach one ship in 4 on a single passage if German detection and coordination succeeded. On arrival, 3 additional merchantmen that had survived the sea passage were bombed in Murmansk harbor in April, transferring part of the risk from sea to shore. Air order of battle on the German side grew across the same period. Luftflotte 5 increased its northern strength from roughly 150 frontline aircraft in January to more than 220 by March, and about 260 by May, including Ju, 88 long-range bombers, and He-111 torpedo bombers positioned to exploit the widening daylight window. The effect was cumulative. Reconnaissance improved convoy localization. Strike packages massed more effectively, and coordination with U-boat patrol lines tightened during clear weather periods. For escort commanders, this meant raising anti-air readiness, preserving ammunition for concentrated attacks rather than sporadic skirmishes, and maneuvering to keep convoys outside predicted strike corridors near Bear Island whenever weather allowed. The largest spring movement before summer, PQ-16 in May 1942 with 36 merchant ships, illustrated both the gains of scale and the vulnerabilities it created. The convoy delivered significant war stores but lost 7 ships en route, with 1 more forced back, a loss proportion of about 26% on the eastbound leg. Cumulative Allied experience showed that larger convoys were easier to find, yet better protected once found. The operational trade-off now turned on whether the delivered weight of cargo per calendar day justified the expected attrition under lengthening daylight. By late May, Allied tallies for the early 1942 cycle noted that 166 merchant ships had sailed for northern Russia, and 145 had completed the journey, a survival rate near 87% across multiple convoys. But with volatility concentrated in those exposed during clear, long light periods. Northern port attacks forced immediate changes in Soviet and Allied discharge methods. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk reorganized pier-side handling so that explosives and aviation fuel moved under guarded schedules directly to rail, while crane ships from arriving convoys remained in theater to augment limited lift capacities at White Sea ports. The goal was to shorten ship time in harbor, lower the density of targets during raids, and push cargo inland despite damaged yards and disrupted sidings. Escort planners treated port vulnerability as an extension of the sea passage risk, arguing for higher frequency but smaller batches during the brightest weeks to reduce on-key accumulation. Far to the south, the first engagements in the Persian Corridor were fought against gradients, axle loads, and workshop depth rather than U-boats. After the August 1941 Anglo-Soviet occupation secured the line of communications, British and Indian engineer units began converting Basra, Khorram Shah, and Bandar Shahpur into through ports. Throughput in late 1941 remained intentionally low, while rails, locomotives, cranes, and repair shops were installed, but planning targets for 1942 to 1943 already envisaged inland clearance capacities above 300,000 long tons per month once American operating units took over, and expanded trucking lines to about 139,500 tons monthly. Early months exposed bottlenecks, single-track mountain sections, limited tunnel clearances affecting locomotive classes, and shortages of heavy-lift cranes. Yet the risk profile differed sharply from the Arctic. Low combat loss probability at sea, with tonnage limited by engineering milestones ashore. On the Pacific leg, initial frictions centered on legal status and port handling, not enemy action. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact permitted Soviet flag shipping to and from American and Canadian West Coast ports, so manifests were consigned accordingly, inspected, and loaded at segregated berths. Vladivostok received the cargoes for transshipment to the Trans-Siberian Railway. Contemporary studies and later scholarship record that the Pacific route ultimately carried a very large share of U.S. Lend-Lease tonnage to the USSR's Far East, enabled by neutrality and constrained by Soviet hull numbers and Siberian rail throughput. In 1941 to 1942, the clash took the form of winter ice management, siding lengths, and guarded schedules for hazardous cargoes, with sea loss rates far lower than on the Barents route so long as neutrality held. These early contacts drove quantitative adjustments across all three routes. In the north, convoy spacing tightened in late winter and early spring to exploit remaining darkness, then shifted towards smaller, more frequent sailings or heavier distant cover as daylight expanded. In Persia, discharge and inland clearance goals were raised in step with workshop activation and locomotive arrivals, creating a rising tonnage curve that could absorb items unsuited to Arctic handling, rails, vehicles, machine tools, without inviting concentrated losses. Across the Pacific, steady low-variance flows were maintained by allocating additional Soviet flag hulls where available and standardizing lashings and blocking to speed rail loading at Vladivostok. Each measure aimed to maximize tons delivered per calendar day, acknowledging that the Arctic offered speed with higher variance, Persia offered growth with engineering lag, and the Pacific offered stability bounded by national shipping and rail limits. Allied and Axis command assessments during this first contact phase converged on the same variables: detection probability, strike mass, escort endurance, and discharge time. German staffs concluded that summer light would be decisive and prepared to exploit it with larger air groups and better air-sea coordination. Allied staffs countered by weighting sailings toward darker months, strengthening anti-air screens, and improving weather routing to use storms as concealment. In aggregate, the opening engagements established empirically what plans had inferred. Arctic deliveries could be forced through winter at acceptable loss rates, but spring and early summer demanded either greater protection or compensating tonnage growth via Persia and the Pacific to maintain overall monthly targets. At the human level, these first months set routines that would persist. Merchant crews adapted to Arctic station keeping at 8 to 9 knots in icing conditions. Soviet dock workers shifted to round-the-clock patterns punctuated by alarms. Iranian railway men and Allied operating units learned mountain timetables and maintenance cycles, and Pacific longshoremen and Soviet consuls standardized documentation to reduce delays. The outcomes were measured not in headlines but in delivered cargo classes: aircraft in crates, tanks, rails, trucks, signal gear, fuel, each delivered by a route whose initial clashes had clarified how season, geography, and enemy action would tax the movement that followed. The crisis arrived with summer light in 1942, when the balance between convoy concealment and German detection swung sharply. After a winter of workable loss rates, the Admiralty attempted to maintain eastbound sailings under longer days, while Luftflotte 5, U-boat patrols, and surface forces concentrated along the Bear Island North Cape arc. The decisive rupture came with PQ-17. Ordered to scatter on July 4th amid reports of a surface breakout. Its 35 merchantmen became isolated targets for submarines and torpedo bombers. 23 ships were sunk before the remainder reached Soviet ports, and cargo losses included hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles that had been counted against the first protocol's targets. The effect was operational and political. Convoy sailings were temporarily suspended. Distant cover policy was reviewed, and the Soviet side faced a gap in high-priority arrivals precisely as fighting escalated in the south. The pause ended with PQ-18 in September 1942, now under heavier escort and the first dedicated escort carrier on the route. The convoy delivered a significant portion of its 40 ships, but still lost 13 under massed air and submarine attacks, despite carrier fighters and strengthened anti-aircraft screens. The engagement demonstrated that added protection could lower the proportion of losses compared with PQ-17, yet daylight still amplified risk beyond winter norms. Allied planners concluded that, for the brightest months, delivered tonnage per day must be upheld by combining fewer Arctic sailings with higher flows elsewhere. German staffs read the same arithmetic in reverse, viewing concentrated air-sea efforts as capable of generating episodic loss spikes large enough to influence Allied schedules. Numbers from the full Arctic campaign underscored the dilemma. Across 1941 to 1945, approximately 3.96 million gross tons were sent via North Russia, with about 7% lost en route, a route-wide ratio shaped disproportionately by the summer of 1942. The variance mattered more than the average. Winter cycles could pass with minimal attrition. Late spring and summer cycles, if detected early and pressed hard, could suffer convoy-level losses that disrupted Soviet intake plans for a quarter. On the quays, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk adapted by forcing explosives and fuels straight to rail, dispersing storage, and using crane ships to augment lift, but every hour a ship remained under air alert multiplied risk. Southward, escalation meant engineering at speed. Through late 1942, British and Indian units continued conversion of Gulf ports and the Trans-Siberian Railway, while the United States expanded its role from specialist missions to operating responsibility. By autumn 1942, Washington named a commanding general for the Persian Gulf Service Command. In early 1943, American railway operating units began taking over sections of the Iranian state railways from the ports north to Tehran, with Soviet crews handling the onward leg. Planning targets drafted that year, port discharge, rail clearance, and road haulage, envisaged inland movement capacities rising toward the low hundreds of thousands of long tons per month once workshops, locomotives, and driver schools were in place. The concept shifted the corridor from an auxiliary route into a backbone for bulk. Trucks, rails, bridging, lubricants, and machine tools staged inland and then moved by Caspian lift, or direct rail to the Volga and beyond. The Stalingrad fighting added its own constraint and then relief. During the second half of 1942, the battle's proximity to the Volga hindered river transfer from northern Iran into the Soviet interior. With the Soviet victory by February 1943, riverine links reopened and the corridor's design premise, a secure year-round southern artery relatively immune to enemy sea interdiction, took full effect. The result in 1943 to 1944 was not a sudden surge but a steady climb, as each rail shop came online and each gradient received locomotives of suitable axle load. Employment figures, tens of thousands of Iranian railwaymen and roughly 100,000 local laborers during peak months, hint at the civil dimension of escalation. Output rose because a multinational workforce learned mountain timetables and depot routines under military direction. Across the Pacific, crisis management took a different form. After December 1941, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact remained in force. Cargoes moved under Soviet flags from West Coast ports to Vladivostok, subject to inspection and with limits on overt war materiel. That constraint shaped manifests, vehicles, locomotives, rails, foodstuffs, non-armored equipment, well suited to the Trans-Siberian. The strategic consequence of the 1942 Arctic pause was to lean harder on this low-loss, steady route. By war's end, roughly half of all tonnage to the USSR moved via the Far East, with loss rates around 1%, a statistical contrast to the northern experience in bright months and a reminder that neutrality could do what no escort could in summer, lower detection and probability to near zero. Axis reactions reflected their own constraints. In Norway, the Kriegsmarine preserved major surface units for rare sorties, while pressing U-boats forward and coordinating with torpedo bomber groups that now fielded larger numbers. The operational aim was to reproduce PQ-17's effect, compel Allied dispersal or suspension by threatening a breakout more than by executing one. German planners recognized, however, that the Persian route lay beyond practical reach except through sabotage. Attempts against Iranian infrastructure in 1943 were planned, but resulted in few executed operations and negligible disruption, a poor return compared with the tonnage impact of a caught Arctic convoy. On the Allied side, escalation produced institutional changes. The Persian Gulf Service Command matured into a full Persian Gulf Command by December 1943. Operating responsibility for Iranian rails and depots broadened, and the corridor's monthly inland clearances rose accordingly. In the north, escort composition shifted. More long-range anti-aircraft cover, refined weather routing, and routing offsets between eastbound and westbound convoys to survive the bright weeks until polar night returned. Across the Pacific, Allied and Soviet authorities standardized documentation and berth allocation to keep turnarounds short. treating Vladivostok siding lengths and crane capacities as the critical variables rather than U-boat densities or torpedo bomber ranges. The human dimension sharpened under crisis conditions. Arctic merchant crews confronted long spells at action stations as torpedo bomber waves formed on radar. Soviet dock workers unloaded under sirens, then returned to frozen quays. Iranian drivers and American mechanics measured progress in axle temperatures, valve jobs, and brake failures on grades. Pacific longshoremen stacked crates to fit Trans-Siberian clearances, while Soviet consuls negotiated cargo categories to avoid disputes with Japanese inspectors. Every adaptation was aimed at the same metric: tons per calendar day delivered to Soviet factories and fronts, with the acceptable loss rate recalibrated route by route as summer lengthened or winter returned. In aggregate, mid-1942 to early 1943 marked the system's most acute test: a northern shock, a southern build-out, and an eastern safety valve that together kept deliveries moving, while combat and season conspired to raise risk on the shortest path. By late 1942, the tempo and scale reached their maximum strain, and in 1943 to 1944, the system operated at its peak under revised naval doctrine and matured infrastructure. At sea, 2 winter battles reset the Arctic balance. On 31 December 1942, a German surface force failed to break convoy JW51B in the Barents Sea. The action persuaded Allied staffs that disciplined screens could hold even against heavy units when radar control, smoke, and concentrated gunfire were used to keep merchantmen intact. German command drew the opposite lesson. Surface sorties risked crippling losses for marginal gains. 12 months later, on December 26, 1943, the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst was brought to action and sunk during the cover for convoy JW55B off the North Cape. With that loss and tighter distant cover policies, the surface threat to Arctic convoys diminished sharply. The remaining risk shifted towards submarines and torpedo bombers, which winter weather and short daylight already constrained. The convoy cycle responded with thicker screens and better air cover. Escort carriers became routine on the most exposed legs. Long-range patrol aircraft extended reconnaissance arcs from Iceland and northern Scotland, and radar-directed anti-aircraft fire disciplined expenditure for massed attacks rather than sporadic skirmishes. Routing moved convoys a few degrees north or south of habitual tracks to avoid fjord-based strike corridors, and weather routing cells learned to trade endurance margins for concealment by threading low-pressure systems. Port routines at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk synchronized with these changes. Explosive cargoes and aviation fuel moved directly from ship to rail under guarded schedules. Crane ships augmented lift, and marshalling yards released through trains on pre-assigned paths to the interior. The cumulative effect was visible in outcomes. Winter 1943 to 1944, convoys delivered most of their ships with single-digit losses per movement, while summer sailings were limited or postponed to prevent daylight-driven spikes in attrition. Peak operations ashore occurred at the opposite end of the map. In the Persian Corridor, 1943 was the transition from build-out to sustained flow. American railway operating battalions took over large sections of the Iranian state railways south of Tehran, while British and Indian engineer units concentrated on the Gulf ports and the lower line. 1942, locomotives and rolling stock shipped in quantity entered service, and repair shops at Khorramshahr and Damascus and Avaz reached planned capacity. Monthly inland clearances climbed toward and then beyond the 200,000 long-ton mark, with selected months surpassing 300,000 as driver schools matured and depots standardized load plans. The mix reflected the corridor's comparative advantage: tens of thousands of trucks, rails by the mile, locomotives, bridging equipment, machine tools, lubricants, and foodstuffs, staged inland for transfer across the Caspian or onward by rail to the Volga hubs. The limiting variables were no longer docks and cranes alone, but axle loads on mountain gradients, tunnel clearances that defined locomotive classes, and workshop throughput measured in valve jobs, wheel trues, and boiler refits per week. The Far Eastern route reached its quantitative crest in the same period. The Soviet-Japanese neutrality arrangement continued to permit Soviet flag sailings from West Coast ports to Vladivostok. Cargoes that fit the legal and operational parameters, locomotives, rails, trucks, non-armored vehicles, machine tools, food, and industrial inputs, moved in steady cycles that produced very low loss rates at sea. Turnaround depended on Vladivostok's cranes and marshalling yards and on Trans-Siberian operating rules for winter. Railway authorities allocated siding lengths and locomotive cycles to push long through trains west, standardizing lashings for vehicles and blocking for crated equipment to compress loading windows. By late 1943, these measures produced flows that, on a cumulative basis, constituted roughly half of all tonnage delivered to the USSR. The statistical contrast with the Arctic, low variance, low loss transit, allowed planners to shift high-volume but time-flexible cargoes eastward while reserving the northern route for compact, urgent consignments that benefited from short sea time under polar night. High command decisions mirrored these technical realities. Allied naval staffs concentrated scarce heavy units in the north to maintain distant cover credible enough to deter remaining surface sorties, but accepted that true protection in bright months lay in schedule control rather than gunnery, sailing fewer convoys when daylight extended beyond safe margins and recovering volume via Persia and the Pacific. Logistics boards in London, Washington, and Moscow set route quotas by calendar quarter, recalculating targets as Persian inland clearances rose and Arctic daylight widened or contracted. Soviet authorities weighted requests toward transport multipliers, trucks, locomotives, rails, alongside selected combat items whose dimensions and handling characteristics fit each route. German command, faced with reduced surface options and weather-constrained air effort, leaned on U-boat patrols and torpedo bomber concentrations to produce episodic spikes in Arctic losses. Planners recognized that sabotage or long-range interdiction against the Persian line offered poor returns against a defended inland corridor. The human cost and civilian footprint were inseparable from these peaks. In Murmansk, rail and port workers labored under recurring air alerts and winter shifts where frostbite, not only bombing, degraded output. Civilian neighborhoods absorbed damage as yards and quays drew attacks. Along the Iranian line, tens of thousands of railwaymen and dock laborers, Iranians under national administration, British and Indian Army units, and American operating personnel sustained mountain timetables that demanded rest cycles, water and fuel points, and maintenance sheds across terrain where a failed brake shoe could block a single-track section for hours. On the Pacific Rim, West Coast longshore crews and inspectors coordinated with Soviet consuls to segregate berths, while Vladivostok's municipal services adjusted to sustain surges in food, fuel, and labor demand associated with long-distance rail loading in winter. None of these workers appeared in convoy tallies, yet their schedules and safety rules determined whether ships turned in days or lingered into the next raid window, whether locomotives cleared grades or stalled, and whether wagon days were wasted or converted into forward movement. At the front, the effects were indirect but measurable. Truck totals arriving via Persia and the Pacific raised the mobility of rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and supply echelons. Rails and locomotives restored line capacity on critical east-west axes. High-octane fuel and aviation spares improved serviceability rates for fighter and attack aircraft. And machine tools stabilized factory outputs after evacuations and wartime wear. Arctic consignments, aircraft in crates, explosives, radar, and communications gear arrived on timelines that matched winter operations when darkness favored passage. Persian consignments, vehicles, and rails in bulk arrived in depth and provided the sustainment layer for campaigns whose consumption rates could not be met by Soviet industry alone in the same time frame. By the close of 1944, the system's peak characteristics were clear. The Arctic route delivered with high winter reliability and managed summer exposure by restraint and cover. The Persian Corridor operated as a high-volume backbone whose monthly clearances approached the upper bands of the original planning tables. And the Far Eastern route maintained a steady flow that by cumulative weight rivaled or exceeded any single alternative. Loss rates diverge by design and by geography. Low in the Pacific under neutrality, moderate to low in Persia, subject to engineering limits ashore, and variable in the Arctic, with winter favoring arrival and summer requiring either stronger protection or fewer sailings. What unified the peak was not a single spectacular movement, but the synchronized performance of three different systems, each operating at the edge of its constraints to keep tons per calendar day at levels that translated industrial promise into sustained combat power. Adaptation began at sea with the way ships were loaded, escorted, and fought. Cargoes for the Arctic were broken into unit loads that cranes could lift in one motion. Crates were stenciled in both languages with rail destination codes, so quayside sorters could send them straight to the correct siding. Merchantmen received de-icing gear, steam lines to free frozen winches, and additional hose reels for firefighting in sub-zero wind. Convoy spacing was adjusted to reduce the target density of a single torpedo spread, and station-keeping drills were practiced at 8 to 9 knots in sleet, where a missed signal could push a freighter out of the protective screen. Escort groups standardized procedures for radar search arcs, star shell illumination, and coordinated turns when aircraft vectors appeared on plot. In daylight months, convoys shifted several degrees of latitude to complicate enemy approach, geometry from fjord bases. In darkness, they accepted rough weather to trade crew fatigue for concealment. Loss rates tracked these adaptations. Winter sailings in 1943 to 1944 often completed with single-digit percentage losses per movement, while summer intervals were deliberately thinned to avoid a repetition of 1942 patterns. Air and submarine threats forced further change. Torpedo bomber mass attacks taught escorts to conserve anti-aircraft ammunition for concentrated peaks rather than dispersing it on reconnaissance flights. Merchant crews learned to stream smoke floats and alter course together at prearranged signal, denying attackers consistent approach angles. Hydrophone operators rotated to preserve hearing acuity in cold. Hedgehog and depth charge attacks followed radar or HF/DF fixes rather than speculative patterns. Distant cover no longer chased every report of a surface breakout, but held barrier lines that forced an enemy into range of radar-controlled gunfire. When the window for air attack elongated in spring, convoy commodores pressed for more fighter cover from escort carriers and for stricter discipline in maintaining formation after damage, on the calculation that a damaged ship inside the screen had a higher survival chance than a sound ship drifting out. On northern keys, the adaptation was to time. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk dispersed high-risk cargoes, pushed explosives and aviation fuel directly from ship to rail under guarded schedules, and used decoy fires and smoke generators to degrade aiming during raids. Crane ships that had brought cargo remained to augment lift. Rail marshalling yards introduced through paths, so trains formed on pre-assigned tracks and departed without resorting. Winter operating rules prioritized thawed switches, hot meals between alarms, and labor rotations that kept fatigue within limits known to raise coupling accidents. The yardsticks were simple: tons per ship hour at berth, and hours from anchor down to first wagon. Measured in these terms, the same dock force could move more tonnage with fewer daylight hours ashore if documentation was correct. Cranes were heated, and trains were released on time. Civilian risk was managed by separating living quarters from hazard storage and by building shelters near work areas, so an alert did not empty the docks. In the Persian Corridor, adaptation meant industrialization of a mountain route. British and Indian engineer units and, later, American operating battalions converted disparate ports and a single-track railway into a predictable flow. Dredging schedules at Basra and Khorram Shah were tied to arrival tables so that channels were at depth before the next convoy rode the tide. Workshop practices were standardized. Boiler wash intervals, bearing inspections, and brake shoe replacements were logged and enforced. Spare parts were cataloged to reduce idle time when a locomotive went to shop. Driver schools taught gear selection and engine braking on gradients that punished both with overheating if mishandled. On the roads, convoy discipline avoided nose-to-tail bunching that blocked grades. Breakdown lanes and recovery teams were posted at known trouble spots. Tonnage rose because failure points became predictable and then rare. By mid-1943, monthly inland clearances moved into the hundreds of thousands of long tons, with selected months passing 300,000 when locomotives, trucks, and shops all met their targets. Resource management followed the same logic. The corridor moved what best fit its yards, trucks in tens of thousands, rails by the mile, locomotives, bridging sets, lubricants, foodstuffs, and machine tools. Items vulnerable to heat or humidity were routed through sheds near the pier. Fuel and explosives moved under separate guard details and scheduling. Iranian railwaymen, dock labor, and mechanics formed the bulk of the workforce, with British, Indian, and American cadres setting rules and providing equipment. Pay scales, rations, and rest days were adjusted to reduce turnover. Medical units handled heat injuries in summer and respiratory illness in winter. The measure of adaptation here was variance as much as volume. Fewer stoppages for avoidable failures produced steadier weekly outputs, allowing planners upstream to load ships confidently against the expected clearance. The Far Eastern route adapted within legal boundaries. Because neutrality required Soviet flags, American and Canadian ports created segregated berths and documentation lanes for Vladivostok consignees. Manifests emphasized cargoes that raised few inspection disputes: locomotives, rails, vehicles without armor, food, and industrial inputs. West Coast longshore crews standardized blocking and bracing, so flat cars in Vladivostok could be loaded with minimal rework. Soviet port authorities synchronized cranes and siding assignments with train paths west. Winter rules prioritized steam supply to points in scheduled snow clearance that kept siding lengths available for long consists. The Trans-Siberian's axle loads and siding geometry defined maximum train weights. Locomotive cycles were therefore allocated by commodity group, with fuel and explosives on guarded shorter consists. Loss rates at sea stayed low, so long as neutrality held. The variable was rail time across Siberia, which fell when schedules, lashings, and siding management were standardized. Axis forces adjusted as well. In northern Norway, Luftflotte 5 reorganized strike groups to mass torpedo bombers and refined tactics to force convoys to turn into or away from torpedo tracks. U-boat commanders learned to trail at the edge of radar coverage and call in airstrikes rather than attack alone. After the failure to break JW51B and the loss of Scharnhorst a year later, surface sorties became rarer and more tightly constrained by weather and radar reports. German analysis emphasized summer concentration and exploitation of clear weather, accepting that polar night would impose low returns. Japanese forces maintained patrols and inspections around the Sea of Japan, while avoiding incidents that could void neutrality, a calculated restraint that shaped both Allied manifests and Soviet scheduling. The psychological dimension followed the arithmetic. Arctic merchant crews worked under routines that balanced vigilance and exhaustion, action stations at likely strike times, rest in short cycles, and strict rationing of fresh water and heat to keep steam for de-icing and pumps. Bonuses for hazard runs, decorations from Allied and Soviet authorities, and organized shore rest after return passages helped hold crews together. Soviet dock workers and railwaymen endured winter hazards and repeated alarms. Incentives took the form of ration supplements and housing near workplaces to shorten commutes during blackout. In Iran, morale rose with competence. As driver schools, graduated classes, and shops met quotas, workers saw the linkage between their schedules and the trains crossing the Caspian. In the Pacific, longshoremen measured success in turnarounds and the absence of disputes at inspection points. Soviet consuls who kept paperwork clean reduced delays that wore on crews. Innovation spread to accounting. Allied supply boards shifted from counting arrivals by ship to counting availability at using units or factories. A truck in Basra or Vladivostok was not a truck in service. Tables, therefore, tracked days from key to first mission. Rails were credited when welded in track, not when stacked in a depot. Aviation engines were recorded serviceable when mounted and tested under local conditions. These changes altered priorities. Crates arrived pre-sorted for immediate assembly, spare parts traveled with equipment in the same convoy, and training materials accompanied specialized items. By late 1943, The question was less how to fill ships than how to convert each ton landed into operational effect within a predictable number of days, route by route and season by season. By adapting in these ways, the system reduced uncertainty where it could and accepted it where it must. The Arctic carried compact, urgent cargoes when darkness favored arrival. Persia absorbed bulk with engineering discipline. The Far East provided a steady, low-variance channel under neutrality. Loss rates and tonnage curves that had once swung with weather and opportunity now reflected deliberate choices: what to move, when to move it, and how to measure success not only at the harbor mouth, but at the railhead in the front. The turning point emerged between winter 1943 to 1944 and the following summer, when the three routes in the revised Convoy system began to yield predictable outcomes that senior staffs could incorporate into campaign planning rather than treating deliveries as contingent favors of weather. In the Arctic, the change in convoy nomenclature from PQ/QP to JW/RA coincided with practices that had been refined since the failures of mid-1942. Radar control, better fighter cover from escort carriers, and barrier tactics for distant cover reduced the chance that a single reconnaissance contact would cascade into coordinated air-sea strikes. The destruction of Scharnhorst removed the most capable German surface raider from the northern theater, and subsequent sorties by heavy units became rare and tightly constrained by weather and radar warning. As a result, winter convoys in 1944 delivered the majority of ships dispatched, and summer schedules were selectively thinned or deferred rather than forced through at any cost. The arithmetic seen at the Admiralty map tables, tons delivered per day of calendar time, adjusted by seasonal loss probability, shifted from volatile to manageable. Soviet planners in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk treated arrivals not as surprises but as nodes in a timetable that could release through trains by pre-assigned paths into the interior. South of the Caucasus, the Persian Corridor crossed its own threshold. By mid-1943, the line functioned as an integrated system, Gulf discharge synchronized with rail shop capacity. Driver schools fed road convoys across the Zagros on known gradients, and locomotive classes were matched to tunnel clearances and axle loads. In 1944, the inland clearance curve reached the upper bands foreseen in earlier tables, with selected months exceeding 300,000 long tons. The flow was dominated by transport multipliers, trucks, rails, locomotives, bridging sets, lubricants, and machine tools that changed not only how much could move at the front, but how factories could sustain output after years of evacuation and strain. For Allied staffs, the corridor's predictability meant that cargoes unsuited to Arctic keys, bulk rails, vehicle parks, depot machinery, could be scheduled months ahead without appreciable risk from enemy interdiction. For Soviet authorities, the southern arrivals supported the rebuilding of trunk lines and motor columns that would be needed for campaigns in 1944 that moved faster and farther than those of 1942. Across the Pacific, the neutrality framework remained intact through 1944, and Vladivostok continued to turn Soviet flag cargoes that drew little risk at sea but demanded disciplined marshalling ashore. The operational turning point here lay in standardized turnarounds. West Coast ports adopted manifest formats and blocking templates that minimized rework on the Trans-Siberian. Vladivostok's cranes, siding lengths, and steam points were sequenced to form long through trains with guarded paths westward. The effect was a sustained low-variance stream that, on cumulative weight, equaled or exceeded any other route's contribution. The constraint shifted from maritime exposure to the speed at which Siberian rails could carry heavier trains during winter, a variable that railway rulebooks and locomotive cycles could manage. Because sea loss probabilities were low, staffs calculated this flow as a baseline, a tonnage floor that would hold even if Arctic sailings paused or if Persian inland clearances dipped during maintenance cycles. Allied High Command translated these technical inflection points into operational decisions. In 1944 to 1945, Soviet offensives required large numbers of motor vehicles and rails to keep artillery and supply echelons mobile across widening fronts. Boards in London and Washington weighted manifests accordingly. High priority, compact items for the Arctic during dark months, high-volume transports and track materials through Persia on a continuous schedule, and steady deliveries of vehicles, locomotives, and industrial inputs via Vladivostok paced to the Trans-Siberian. The measure of success shifted again, from ships arrived to days from key to unit to the capacity of field armies to maintain planned rates of advance. A truck counted only when it hauled ammunition. A rail length counted only when welded into track. An engine counted only when it pulled a scheduled consist. The turning point, therefore, was not a single convoy or contract, but the point at which staffs could treat the three routes as complementary instruments tuned to season and cargo class, rather than as ad hoc expedients. Axis assessments reflected the same transition. In Norway, with heavy units constrained and polar night limiting air massing, German staffs prioritized summer windows and episodic strikes designed to raise loss proportions, rather than continuous interdiction. The tactical aim remained to reproduce the effect of 1942, but the strategic judgment acknowledged diminishing returns as escorts thickened and distant cover adhered to barrier doctrine. Sabotage options against the Persian Corridor offered limited prospects given depth of defense and distance from active fronts. In the Far East, Japanese patrols and inspections continued under neutrality, but the chance of political or operational incidents narrowed as both sides recognized the costs of altering a status quo that kept the Pacific route low loss for Soviet cargoes. The civilian experience made the shift visible at ground level. In Murmansk, dock gangs measured improvement in hours from anchor to first wagon, rather than in the number of alarms. With better shed heat and improved documentation, the same crews moved more tons in shorter Arctic days. Along the Iranian line, Iranian railwaymen, British and Indian engineer units, and American operating personnel hit maintenance and dispatch targets with fewer unplanned stoppages. Availability of locomotives rose as boiler wash cycles, bearing inspections, and wheel trues were enforced to schedule. At Vladivostok, longshore crews worked deciding plans that produced longer, heavier trains with fewer delays from frozen points. These were not isolated efficiencies. They were evidence that the system's weakest links, icing winches, underrated gradients, haphazard manifests, had been converted into routines. On the Soviet side of the front, the consequences were practical. Rifle divisions received higher truck densities. Artillery regiments sustained longer firing schedules through improved supply. Air units raised serviceable rates with steadier spares and fuels. The rebuild of rail capacity on key east-west axes reduced turnaround times for operational reserves. When offensives launched in 1944, logistics tables could assume that certain classes of goods would arrive in predictable volumes by predictable dates, route by route. The dependence on season did not vanish, but it no longer dictated whether an operation could proceed. It dictated how staffs balanced the three arteries to meet the calendar. Finally, the turning point altered political accounting. Public statements in Allied capitals continued to cite arrivals and targets, but internal boards relied on route quotas and seasonal curves that had proved reliable over successive quarters. Soviet releases linked industrial outputs to combined sources, domestic production supplemented by defined deliveries, without specifying schedules. German communiques still publicized sinkings, but could not point to extended interruptions comparable to mid-1942. The net effect was to stabilize expectations on all sides. For the Allies and the USSR, this meant that supply promised on paper translated into availability at the front, with a lag measured in weeks, not in uncertainties. For Germany and Japan, it meant that interdiction could impose costs but not reliably force a strategic deficit unless a decisive political event changed the premises. The logistics system had moved from improvisation to method, and with that change, the Eastern Theater's supply calculus turned from weather and chance to calendars and quotas. The end of combat operations in Europe closed one set of schedules and opened another. In the Arctic, the last eastbound JW convoys sailed in spring 1945 under conditions that bore little resemblance to the summer of 1942. Air and surface threats had been reduced by cumulative losses and by the winter doctrine that emphasized radar control, barrier cover, and strict station keeping. JW66 reached Kola Bay in early May with most ships present. The reciprocal RA movements cleared home waters as German surrender approached on May 8th, with U-boats surrendering and Luftflotte 5 no longer mounting mass strikes. The Admiralty terminated the northern cycle. Distant cover units were reassigned, escorts redistributed to demobilization tasks, and convoy commodores released to peacetime postings. In Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, port committees shifted from air raid protocols to clearance of wrecks, repair of sheds and cranes, and the return of requisition labor to civilian industries. Quayside risk no longer came from bombs, but from routine hazards, damaged pilings, frozen switchgear, and the backlog of cargo marshaled for inland movement during the last winter of the war. Withdrawal from the Persian Corridor followed a different calendar. By mid-1945, the Gulf ports and the Trans-Siberian Railway had reached predictable throughputs, with monthly inland clearances in the upper ranges of the previous year's tables. American operating units prepared to hand sections of track and depots back to Iranian state railways. British and Indian engineer formations concentrated on transferring workshops, spare parts, and administrative records. The tripartite arrangements required foreign forces to depart within set time frames after hostilities, and handover plans reflected that obligation. Inventories of locomotives and rolling stock, disposition of cranes and machine tools, and training notes for maintenance cycles that Iranian crews would continue. In practice, demobilization created its own bottlenecks. The same single-track gradients that constrained wartime flows limited the speed of repatriating personnel and equipment. Driver schools now taught return convoys. Workshops scheduled final boiler washes and inspections before locomotives were transferred. Depots converted stock ledgers from Allied to national accounting. Across the Pacific, the route closed not because of sea losses, but because the legal premise for Soviet flag neutrality ended. In August 1945, the USSR entered the war against Japan. The short land campaign in Manchuria, followed by Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September, removed the diplomatic framework that had kept sea risk low for Vladivostok sailings. West Coast ports wound down segregated berths for Soviet consignees. Soviet maritime authorities reallocated hulls to post-war needs, and Vladivostok rail yards adjusted to a mix of demobilization traffic and residual Lend-Lease consignments already in the pipeline. The limiting factor remained the Trans-Siberian's operating rules, axle loads, siding lengths, and winter schedules, now applied to peacetime cargoes and movements of personnel. Immediate consequences appeared at the interface between war planning and peacetime law. Lend-Lease shipments in the pipeline on VJ Day required settlement, whether to complete delivery, divert to other uses, or return to origin. Items already issued to Soviet units or factories remained in place. Unused stocks in ports and depots were counted for disposition under intergovernmental agreements. Reverse Lend-Lease, the provision of local services by Allied partners during the war, needed reconciliation with inventories of equipment that had been transferred with the expectation of return or payment after hostilities. For port authorities, the question narrowed to documentation. A locomotive at Endemeshk or a truck in Vladivostok had to be recorded as delivered, transferred, or returned. Spare parts had to be matched to their parent equipment to avoid orphan inventories. The practical effect was a final surge of paperwork, manifests reconciled with waybills, workshop ledgers compared with depot stocks, and convoy tallies aligned with factory receipts. Loss accounting closed the maritime ledger. Over the northern route, cumulative dispatches amounted to millions of tons, with a loss proportion in single digits across the entire campaign, weighted by the concentrated sinkings during the bright months of 1942. The return legs carried ballast, prisoners of war, and occasionally evacuees. With the end of air and surface threats, return convoys ceased to require distant cover. Merchant and escort losses were compiled for claims and pensions, and wrecks charted for future clearance. In the Persian system, sea loss to enemy action had been negligible. The index of risk had always been engineering variance ashore. Post-war reports therefore read like shop manuals. Mean time between failures for locomotives. brake shoe wear rates on specific gradients, throughput per crane hour at named berths. The Pacific leg's maritime losses were minimal. The longest entries in its files concerned rail delays, winter operating costs, and the disposition of specialized lashings and blocking gear that had been standardized for Trans-Siberian loading. For Soviet users, the withdrawal phase meant absorbing equipment into peacetime structures. Trucks that had moved ammunition now hauled building materials. Rails laid under wartime pressure became components of a post-war network. Locomotives and machine tools shifted from emergency replacement to planned maintenance cycles. Aviation fuel specifications and spare parts tables transitioned to domestic production schedules, or to import regimes different from wartime priorities. Commanders who had measured success in regiment days of fuel or wagon days of rail capacity now reported on reconstruction benchmarks, kilometers of track reopened to civilian traffic, average turnaround times for freight at regional hubs, and vehicle availability rates outside combat zones. The change did not erase wartime practices. It redirected them to rebuilding. The human dimension of withdrawal touched the same crews who had sustained the flow. Arctic merchant sailors returned to coastal and transatlantic routes or left the sea. Some escorted wreck locations for salvage and memorial duties. Dock workers in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk pivoted from unloading under sirens to clearing damaged sheds and laying new track spurs. Housing near the ports remained crowded while repairs progressed. In Iran, railwaymen and dock crews continued under national administration, applying skills learned in wartime, boiler washes, bearing inspections, dispatch rules, to peacetime schedules. West Coast longshore gangs reassigned to commercial cargoes. Soviet consular staffs that had specialized in neutral cargo documentation reduced or rotated. Political tensions accompanied the timetable in some districts. Allied withdrawal commitments in Iran were read against local expectations of rapid departure. Soviet and Western schedules diverged, and regional disputes followed. In northern waters, the removal of the surface threat and the end of convoying left minefields and wrecks that required clearance. The Barents and White Sea approaches remained hazardous until minesweeping finished and channels were recharted. On the Pacific Rim, the rapid shift from neutrality to war and then to post-war arrangements required the reissue of port and inspection rules. None of these issues resembled the tactical problems of torpedo tracks or air raids, but each affected the rate at which wartime logistics could be converted into civilian systems. Totals and proportions, viewed at the end rather than in the middle, explained why the system survived its crises. On a cumulative basis, the Far Eastern route moved the largest share of tonnage with the lowest sea loss proportion. The Persian Corridor delivered a comparable share with losses driven by engineering failures more than by enemy action, and the Arctic carried compact, time-sensitive cargoes at higher variance, with winter cycles delivering heavily in bright months selectively curtailed. By May-September 1945, these patterns shaped how withdrawal unfolded. The North switched off quickly once the threat vanished. The South tapered as operations and legal control returned to national authorities, and the East adjusted to new political conditions while clearing the pipeline. The final act of withdrawal was administrative but decisive for historical understanding. When staffs closed their ledgers, they preserved the route-by-route arithmetic that had governed the war: tons per calendar day, loss proportions by season, clearance times from key to unit, axle loads and siding lengths, crew rotations and shop capacities. Those tables, completed after the last convoy, explain the immediate aftermath better than any single incident. They show why certain classes of cargo moved where they did, how season and geography set the limits, and how, once combat ended, the same constraints determined how quickly a wartime machine could be stood down without losing what it had learned. The logistics system left a record measurable in equipment, infrastructure, and procedures that outlasted the war. On the equipment ledger, deliveries that moved along the three routes translated into categories with different operational impacts. Trucks in the hundreds of thousands raised divisional mobility, allowing rifle divisions and artillery echelons to sustain planned rates of advance. Locomotives and rails restored line capacity on east-west axes after evacuations and destruction. machine tools stabilized output at relocated factories, high-octane fuel and spares improved aircraft serviceability. Radios and radar sets increased command and detection ranges. Measured by totals credited to the USSR across the program, major categories included roughly 375,000 trucks, more than 1,900 locomotives, large quantities of rail and bridge material, over 7,000 tanks, and more than 14,000 aircraft, reaching units and plants with a delay defined by route and season. The time element, days from key to unit or factory, proved as important as the totals. Arctic consignments often reached users within weeks during winter darkness. Persian bulk arrived in depth on schedules tied to rail shops and driver schools. Pacific flows provided steady replacement rates paced by Trans-Siberian operating rules. Route proportions shaped post-war debates. Cumulative weight delivered via the Far Eastern line constituted about half of total tonnage, with sea loss rates near 1% under neutrality. The Persian Corridor accounted for a comparable share as infrastructure matured, with negligible combat losses at sea, but significant dependence on workshop throughput and mountain operating rules. The Arctic carried several million tons, including 3.96 million gross tons, credited to North Russia, with an overall loss proportion near 7%, concentrated in the bright months of 1942. These ratios framed later assessments. One route maximized safety at sea and depended on domestic rail. One offered rising capacity as engineers converted ports and a mountain railway. One offered speed under winter concealment at higher variance in summer. Each carried classes of cargo suited to its limits, which is why aggregate tonnage alone does not capture the operational effect of trucks, rails, machine tools, and fuels that arrived when needed at scales that individual Soviet plants could not replace in the same time frame. Institutional legacies were procedural rather than symbolic. Allied convoy doctrine, barrier cover, radar fire control, escort carrier integration, HF/DF queuing, weather routing, migrated into post-war naval manuals. Port practices developed at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, direct ship-to-rail schedules for hazardous cargoes, heated sheds, crane ship augmentation, and through-path marshalling reappeared in civilian logistics planning for icebound ports. In Iran, the codification of boiler wash intervals, bearing inspections, wheel truing, and dispatch rules for single-track mountain lines carried over to Iranian state railways when Allied operating units withdrew. Shop tools and locomotive classes remained in service through the post-war decade. On the Pacific Rim, standardized blocking and bracing and manifest formats used at West Coast berths and in Vladivostok yards influenced later container-era documentation practices, even as equipment types changed. Civilian footprints were durable. Housing built or requisitioned near Arctic quays remained a feature of port districts. Repairs to sheds, cranes, and sidings set the baseline for peacetime expansion. Along the Persian line, road improvements, depots, and workshops created employment patterns that survived the return of operations to national control. The multinational workforce, Iranians, British, and Indian Army personnel, American operating units, had learned rules that made failure predictable and therefore preventable. The same rules applied to grain, building materials, and passenger traffic after wartime consignments tapered. In the Soviet Far East, port and marshalling practices continued to shape Vladivostok's throughput and the allocation of locomotive cycles across Siberia. Operational consequences appeared in how the Red Army fought in 1944 to 1945. Higher truck densities allowed sustained exploitation after breakthroughs. Rails and locomotives repaired trunk lines faster, moving ammunition and reserves at scales consistent with successive operations. The serviceability of aircraft rose with stable deliveries of fuel and spares. These effects did not occur because any single route delivered more than all others, but because staffs treated the routes as complementary instruments and tuned manifests to season and handling. When offensives were planned, tables assumed a floor of tonnage from the Pacific, a rising southern flow as workshops matured, and an Arctic pulse during winter darkness for compact, high-priority cargoes. The resulting ability to predict availability within weeks rather than by weather alone narrowed the gap between industrial promise and combat power. Memory and commemoration diverge by polity. In the USSR, the emphasis fell on domestic production and sacrifice, with Lend-Lease presented as auxiliary. Soviet publications nonetheless recorded categories: trucks, rails, locomotives, non-ferrous metals that matched factory needs. In Britain and the United States, convoy narratives highlighted the Arctic theater's hazards and the adoption of escort carrier doctrine, while institutional histories emphasized the Persian build-out as an example of engineering logistics at scale. In Iran, the wartime line intersected with domestic politics. Withdrawal schedules and the disposition of facilities became part of post-war debates over sovereignty and foreign presence. In Japan, the neutrality period and Soviet flag sailings to Vladivostok received limited public attention during the war and entered post-war scholarship mainly as a factor in Soviet industrial supply. Historiographical disputes turned on weighting. Analysts who privilege combat losses emphasize the summer of 1942 and convoy-level attrition. Those who weight cumulative tonnage point to Pacific and Persian figures. Those who examine operational outcomes stress the arrival of transport multipliers, trucks, rails, locomotives, over headline items. A balanced reading treats the three perspectives as complementary. Convoy risk influenced schedules and public narratives. Cumulative tonnage determined depth of replacement, and the timing of specific categories determined whether units could move and factories could hold output. Quantitative records, tons per calendar day by route, loss proportions by season, hours from anchor to first wagon, inland clearance per shop hour, anchor these arguments in measurable effects rather than generalities. The loss ledger and the human ledger also remain. Merchant sailors, escorts, dock workers, railwaymen, longshore crews, and mechanics carried risks and routines that statistics can summarize but not erase. Compensation, pensions, and memorials followed national lines, yet the work itself was transnational. Cargoes loaded in North America and the Gulf, escorted past Norway, discharged at Arctic quays, moved across Iran and the Caspian, and hauled along Siberian rails. Post-war mine clearance, wreck charting, and infrastructure repair extended the time horizon of risk beyond the armistice, a reminder that loss proportions are not confined to battle dates. The strategic legacy is methodological. The system demonstrated that multinational logistics can be tuned to geography and season with route-specific doctrines, that measuring success at the point of use rather than at the key changes priorities, and that steady low-variance flows can offset high-variance fast routes if staffs manage categories rather than headlines. Later coalitions drew on this experience when balancing airlift against sea lift, contested routes against inland corridors, and immediate delivery against sustainable throughput. The war ended, but the arithmetic, what to move, when to move it, by which path, and how to measure the conversion from ton landed to effect achieved, remained a continuing reference for military and civilian planners. In sum, the Arctic convoys, the Persian Corridor, and the Far Eastern route were not competing answers to a single problem, but specialized tools in a coordinated system. Their combined record, tonnage distributions, seasonal patterns, loss rates, and conversion times explains both wartime outcomes and post-war infrastructures that drew on the same rails, shops, cranes, and rulebooks. The logistics of Lend-Lease to the USSR thus entered history not as an episode, but as a set of practices and capacities whose influence persisted wherever distance, weather, and risk still govern how materiel moves.